Lurking within the swirling vortex of the 1990s was an unforgiving darkness that disrupted the decade's vibrant rhythm with notes of violence, tragedy, and despair. In crept the unyielding treachery that left behind a trail of unforgettable moments that scarred our collective psyche forever. It was January 1990 when warnings of a cold front forming over the North Atlantic rang across northern and central Europe. These warnings were preceded by a warm winter weather temperature, which reached an unusual 20 degrees just before Christmas. Residents of Europe heeded the warnings and began to prepare for a chill in the air. On the 25th of January, that bitterness did certainly come, but it brought something treacherous along with it. It wasn't just about the frigidity that was brewing off the shores. It was one of the worst storms in history, giving the new decade an ill start. As the cold front depression deepened, it began to move rapidly toward land, and by the early hours of that morning, Cyclone Daria was wreaking havoc over Ireland. As it raced across the sky, the storm brought with it record-breaking winds between 110 and 120 kilometers an hour, with strong gusts measuring around 170 kilometers an hour. It was sudden wind bursts such as these that would cause extensive damage that would lead to the initial 15 fatalities in Ireland alone. Named after the national poet, Robert Burns, whose birthday fell on this very day, they referred to this memorial moment as Burns Day Storm. Gale force winds and torrential rain brought flooding to Great Britain. All along the coast of West Wales to Kent, winds reaching 140 kilometers an hour battered the shores. The mean hourly wind speed was likened to a Category 1 hurricane. Some buildings were reduced to rubble, causing widespread fatalities totaling about 47, making it the worst natural tragedy since the 1953 floods. As residents of Europe tried to stick out the remainder of the storm, believing it would be over soon, they came to a disturbing truth. The storm was devoted to a 2-day-long onslaught, furthering the damage and fatalities, and leaving an incredibly negative mark on history. Compared to the 1987 Great Storm, this cyclone was more destructive, with more than double the fatalities. The Burns Day Storm only marked the beginning of a turbulent decade. It was the year of the Hubble telescope launch, the end of the Cambodian Civil War, and the beginning of free elections in Taiwan. Despite the disruptive start to the decade, positivity was blooming, with the information age seeing its rapid growth. It was also in 1991, though, that the Persian Gulf War was reaching its crescendo. The war had been raging for a year, triggered by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, had ordered the invasion and occupation of the country in an effort to acquire its large oil reserves. They also aimed to cancel the debt that Iraq owed Kuwait and expand their power in the region. The Gulf War was the first largest international crisis since the Cold War era that saw an increase in tension, belligerence, and spitefulness. Hussein's orders ended up being successful, allowing Iraqi forces to occupy the country, and they refused to leave. In response to the war, on the 16th of January, the United Nations coalition forces launched an assault against Iraq's military. 10 days later, though, something else would be dominating the news. Several news outlets began to report on a sudden event. Large amounts of crude oil were leaking into the Persian Gulf, giving it the name the Gulf War oil spill, which was placed among the top 10 worst oil disasters in history. Events like these were, of course, nothing new. Oil spills have been happening since the dawn of the 19th century, when the product came into use. The disaster, though, was different. Instead of being the result of an accident, poor vessel quality, or unforeseen circumstances of any kind, it was intentional. The Gulf War oil spill was the last-ditch effort to stop the forces from the United States, as part of the coalition from landing on the shores of Kuwait. The Iraqi military gathered up millions of gallons of crude oil from 8 oil tankers, 2 terminals, a tank field, and a refinery, and released it all into the Persian Gulf. Anticipating a rather ambitious invasion, the military also dug trenches along the coastline, filling them with oil too. The entire act of environmental threat racked up at least 11 million barrels of oil. For the next 3 months, the substances would continue to spread through the Gulf at a rate of 6,000 barrels per day. This wasn't the end of Iraq's response either. Upon retreating from Kuwait, they would set 732 oil wells ablaze, and by May of that year, the company calculated that there were as many as 6 million barrels burning each day. Much of the substance that was spilled into the Gulf spread along the coastline, but most of it would remain behind in the Abu Ali Island region north of Saudi Arabia. 706 kilometers worth of Saudi Arabian coastline was drenched in a thick, tarry blanket. Christmas time is generally filled with joy, jingling bells and flickering lights. It's rarely the case that the infectious laughter is replaced by the echoes of screams. But in December of 1992, those harrowing screeches were what rang out through Dayton, Ohio. Back in the 1990s, this small town certainly looked like a merry dream, allowing residents to quickly get into the festive spirit. It was Christmas Eve when the town's residents began settling down with their loved ones, preparing for gift-giving and hearty meals. They enjoyed the pop-up shops, tree decorating, and festivities. Little did they know that in one particular household, a group of 4 were preparing for a very different kind of Christmas, where Santa's suit wouldn't be the only apparent red. That fateful eve, Marvelous Keene, disappointed by the cards he was dealt in life, hit a breaking point. He, his girlfriend Laura Taylor, their friend DeMarcus Smith, and his girlfriend Heather Matthews banded together to form the Downtown Posse. The group, bored by the scene, decided to find entertainment in the form of a homicidal spree. The onslaught began with a victim whom Heather knew and was well aware of his lucrative job at General Motors. The victim was Joseph Wilkerson, who agreed to meet up with her following some enticing promises. Falling for the beguile, Joseph invited the woman to his home, but she arrived with extra company. The 2 men would jump the unsuspecting man, robbing him of whatever personal effects he carried. But petty robbery wasn't their ultimate goal. Using electrical cords, Joseph was tied down to his bed. Marvelous and DeMarcus ransacked the rest of the house, and they came across a .32 caliber firearm. With adrenaline coursing through their bodies, the group turned the firearm on Joseph, executing him where he lay. Hungry for more, the group stole their victim's car and headed to a neighborhood market in West Dayton. There, they saw Danita Gillette, who had a young child waiting for her at home. She was heading to the payphone when 4 strangers approached her, weapons at the ready, and demanded that she hand over her belongings. Even though she complied with their orders, they opened fire, and 5 bangs echoed throughout the town. Danita was slain over her shoes, coat, backpack, and just 50 cents. The Downtown Posse's next stop was Heather's ex-boyfriend's house. Jeffrey Wright was sitting outside his house when they arrived. DeMarcus was the one to draw his firearm, aiming for the man's legs, pulling the trigger 4 times as he tried to flee. Jeffrey was able to crawl to his neighbor's garden and was immediately rushed to the hospital, surviving the attempt on his life. The group, believing they just claimed their 3rd victim, headed back to Joseph's place, where he lay unmoving on the bed, still tied down. The home of the deceased became a party zone, and eventually their base of operations. Then it was Christmas Day. Despite the joyous occasion, the posse decided to continue their spree, opting to target another ex-boyfriend. This time he was Laura's. She tricked Richard Maddox into leaving his parents' home and going on a car ride together. During the drive, Richard began noticing that they were being tailed. It was the Downtown Posse. Upon realizing this, he began to accelerate, but Laura pulled out a Derringer and placed it right at his temple. Just seconds later, she pulled the trigger and jumped from the vehicle, which headed straight towards a tree, with Richard's body at the wheel. Laura had escaped from the car in the nick of time, and the brush with mortality caused a break. For the rest of that day, the group rested, only to begin the onslaught once more on the 26th of December. They headed to a family store on West 5th Street, known as Shortstop Mini Market, where Laura entered first. She acted as the scout, checking the place out before signaling the 2 men. They entered, drew their weapons on Sarah Abraham, a mother of 3 who was working behind the front counter, and fired. She wasn't alone at the store, though. Jones Pettis was also there, and was assaulted by the group, but survived the wounds he sustained to his stomach and hand. Jones was now scarred for life, and Sarah's children were left motherless over just $44. Somehow involved in the spree were another two individuals, Marvin Washington and Wendy Cottrill, who were involved. Following the slaying of Sarah and the assault on Jones, it seemed that the posse became alarmed by what these two individuals knew, viewing them as witnesses or snitches. So that day, Wendy and Martin drove with the group with the promise of a party, but instead they were taken to a graveyard, yanked from the car, and executed. From there, they acquired a new car by waving a firearm around in one woman's face and swapping its license plate. They'd been swapping the plates since the start of the spree, hoping to avoid detection. It wouldn't be until later that day that one Dayton police officer would spot the suspicious vehicle and discover it was stolen. The downtown posse's jig was up. Their crime spree was revealed, and they were placed in cuffs, ending the massacre that marred the Christmas of 1992. Among the most violent wars and grisliest of homicides, there's one thing that's always been more disturbing. Something that laid waste to whole countries, leaving their people in agony, wondering what they did to deserve it. That thing is disease. The bubonic plague wreaked havoc across the land, laying waste to anyone in its path. Flu was no different, claiming up to 90% of the Breivik mission when it made landfall in 1918. Stories of the treachery that the sufferers had faced made their way into history books, serving as more of a horror story than a true event. You can only imagine the fear and panic when, in 1993, a fatal disease ran rampant in the Four Corners, the only place in the United States where four states meet. The borders of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah all came together. But sharing borders also means sharing disease. It was May when a young 19-year-old marathon runner landed up in a New Mexico hospital. He had no known health issues, but was admitted with flu-like symptoms and shortness of breath. 3 days later, he was gone. It turned out that just a few days earlier, his fiancée had suffered the same fate, having experienced unexplained respiratory illness. The couple's inexplicable demise forced the New Mexico Office of Medical Investigations to take a thorough look at the area, and within a matter of hours, 5 more cases of young, healthy people had succumbed to sudden respiratory failure. When initial tests failed to determine the cause of these ominous ends, the CDC was forced to intervene. The organization, together with several other health departments of 3 states, including the Navajo Nation, the Indian Health Service, and the University of New Mexico, began their efforts to solve the mystery of these cases. The initial details made it obvious that they were dealing with an unknown virus, but a closer look using new methods that looked at the molecular structure helped them determine what the strange disease was. The health departments discovered that this rampant new virus was not a disease at all, but rather a new strain of one that had already been around for quite some time. It was a never-before-seen and fatal strain of the Hantavirus, one that's generally only transmitted through rodents. That summer, health authorities trapped up to 1,700 different types of rodents that lived within the areas that the victims of the disease called home. While there were several rodents infected, deer mice were found to have the most cases. The victims' households were found to have more rodents in comparison to neighboring, unaffected homes where residents cleaned thoroughly or worked with soil. From May of 1993 until the end of the year, the virus continued to infect the inhabitants of the Four Corners, leading to 13 fatalities, a disturbingly high mortality rate of about 50%. O.J. Simpson was a football star back in high school, serving as a tackle and then as a fullback. By the time he was an adult, he'd already set team records, won the Heisman Trophy, and was a member of the world record-setting 440-yard relay team. Simpson became the #1 draft choice in the AFL Buffalo Bills, setting single-season records for years gained rushing. His popularity, though, extended beyond just field play. He found equal success as a spokesperson and film actor. Simpson's career successes, though, would be overshadowed by something that would make him even more popular: the homicide of Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman. Simpson and Nicole married in 1985, following his previous divorce. The marriage to his second wife, though, didn't last long either, and by 1992, they were divorced too. Ron Goldman was a friend of Nicole's, a restaurant waiter and an aspiring actor. The two allegedly had no romantic involvement and were just very good friends. They were such good friends that Nicole invited her family for a dinner out at the Los Angeles restaurant where Ron was waitering on the evening of the 12th of June, 1994. The family enjoyed their meal and then headed home, not knowing that something sinister was awaiting them. Later that evening, Ron headed to the family's Brentwood condominium, carrying glasses that had been left behind by one of the family members. Around midnight, family members stepped out into the front courtyard, only to come across a harrowing sight. Nicole and Ron were both deceased and red-stained, having been victims of a fatal puncturing assault. The police arrived at a brutal scene and prompted an immediate and extensive investigation. Their efforts led them to the door of O.J. Simpson, who claimed to have been in Los Angeles that evening, but took a flight to Chicago that same night, seemingly prior to midnight. Law enforcement questioned him and found no reason to arrest him at that moment. But 5 days later, prosecutors were pushing him to surrender. Bizarrely, Simpson decided to flee instead, climbing into his white Ford Bronco with Al Crowlings and making a getaway. He would lead the police on a slow chase that brought the freeways of Southern California to a frustrating standstill. This chase also drew in a 95 million American audience. News helicopters whopped overhead, documenting the unfolding event, with motorists and bystanders waving excitedly as police cruisers drove past in pursuit of the Bronco that carried a homicide suspect within. Eventually, Simpson would pull over, surrendering to the cuffs, and he was taken into custody. What followed was an extensive trial, where defense attorneys maintained that Simpson was wrongly accused. The prosecutors claimed that he was a controlling husband who allegedly was known for domestic assault when it came to his relationship with Nicole. They also pointed out an unavoidable piece of evidence: the vital fluid found in the suspect's car and house. Terminating the prosecution's argument was the gloves they submitted as evidence, suggesting they'd been worn by the assailant. When Simpson tried to put the gloves on, though, they didn't fit, leading to the famous words from the defense, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." By the following year, those words rang true in the courtroom, and the accused was acquitted of all criminal charges as he continued to maintain his innocence. 2 years later, the case was reopened when Simpson was taken to civil court, which ultimately led him to be found guilty and stated the suspect was liable for the wrongful demise. He was ordered to pay $33.5 million in damages to both families. It was a Tuesday, 5:46 a.m., the 17th of January, 1995. Most residents of the southern Hyogo Prefecture in west central Honshu were still asleep or just waking up. Their alarm clocks wouldn't be their usual wake-up call. Instead, their walls shook dramatically, sending shock and panic throughout households. It was the Great Hanshin earthquake, Japan's second most fatal earthquake of the 20th century. The violent shaking marked one of the darkest days in modern history for the country. Alternatively called the Kobe earthquake, it erupted along the Nojima Fault, which lies near the boundary where the Philippine Sea Plate withdraws underneath the Amurian microplate. It lasted just 20 seconds, but in a moment, it felt like forever, as many residents' lives flashed before their eyes. The quake registered a harrowing magnitude of 6.9, which is 7.3 on the Richter scale, the equivalent of 1,300,000,000 kilograms of TNT. The aftermath of the violent tremor was staggering. An estimate of 400,000 buildings were destroyed. More than 300,000 people were displaced. Almost 44,000 were injured, and more than 6,400 met an untimely and panic-filled demise. This made it the worst quake to ever hit Japan since the Tokyo-Yokohama earthquake of 1923, which claimed more than 140,000 lives. More than half of the buildings that were affected were fully collapsed, and portions of the Hanshin Expressway that linked Kobe and Osaka had sustained heavy damage, leading them to crumble away, making the roadways unusable. The Great Hanshin earthquake became most notable for its exposure of how vulnerable the infrastructure really was. Those who proclaimed that their construction capabilities were superior and earthquake-resistant were ultimately proved wrong by the number of buildings that were supposedly destruction-proof having collapsed. While it may appear as though an invisible hand is holding an airplane up in the sky, speed is the real cause behind the almost magical maneuver, preventing the people carrying craft from plummeting to its grim end. In fact, speed is the most important part of flying. It allows the aircraft to generate lift, stay in flight, maintain control, and ensure it doesn't just drop out of the sky. Pilots are generally extensively trained, but they also rely on air traffic control and instructions from the ground. Instructions such as what speed they should maintain. But those instructions can only be correctly carried out when it's understood from inside the plane itself. There are many numbers, levers, and control panels that take up a large portion of the cockpit. While rare, this chaotic clutter can sometimes cause pilots to lose their wits. Back on the ground, though, similar errors may also be developing, ultimately resulting in the aircraft making a quick departure from the airborne highway. This was the very distressing situation that pilots of the Turkish Boeing 757 found themselves in, just moments after takeoff during Birgenair Flight 301. On the 6th of February, 1996, they departed from the Gregorio Luperon International Airport, located in the Dominican Republic. It was around midnight when the flight began to take off, navigating through the thick darkness using a lit-up runway. The captain of the craft realized something unusual. His airspeed indicator wasn't working properly and was displaying the wrong airspeed. Instead, he navigated the departure using the first officer's calls of speed, since his indicator seemed to be working. Once they were airborne, the captain's indicator seemed to be working again, indicating they were increasing airspeed. Amid the climb out, once the autopilot and auto throttle were engaged, the crew discovered that the airspeed indications were abnormal again. The craft was now entering a distressingly high altitude, with the speed indicator still showing an increase. An overspeed warning flashed in the cockpit, but the crew believed that this was nothing more than an error, deactivating the warning system. And what a crucial mistake that would prove to be. When the airspeed indication still showed a high reading, the stall warning then activated, and the auto throttle and vertical navigation mode also disengaged as a result. It was soon realized that the crew had become discombobulated by the combined readings of the plane pitch, the false airspeed reading, and the conflicting warnings. A number of thrust and pitch changes occurred in succession, deviating from proper procedure. These changes led to a loss of control and stalling, almost 5 minutes after takeoff. The aircraft rolled. Its nose took a steep dive, and it was sent plummeting into the water, northeast of Puerto Plata. There were 13 crew members aboard, along with 176 passengers, but there were no survivors. Karl Draga was a New Haven, Connecticut man, born to Polish immigrants. He claimed he'd served as a military man during the Korean War. In adulthood, he began working in construction and lived in Manchester, New Hampshire. The carpenter then moved to Bow, where he built a home for his family. But just a year after moving there, his wife Rita would pass away from cancer. From there, it seemed that things would only fall apart for Draga, who was already known by law enforcement officials. Allegedly, he had quite the extensive history with law over code enforcement-related problems, which date back to the 70s, regarding his Columbia, New Hampshire vacation house that sat on the banks of the Connecticut River. Following a rainstorm, the riverbank collapsed, and Draga began to pack all sorts of debris in an effort to repair the erosion and shore up the embankment. The state, though, believed he was trying to change the river's course, and in 1995, the town's selectmen, along with the town tax assessor, headed to the property with the dispute. To drive them away, Draga drew his firearm, firing a few shots into the air. After that, he went and bought a Colt AR-15, an armored vest, and rigged his vacation property with motion detectors and electronic noise, one of the first warning signs to an unstable situation that would ultimately become fatal. Over the years, with continued conflict from government officials and being named the town troublemaker, Draga finally snapped. On the 19th of August, 1997, he was driving to Columbia, New Hampshire in his pickup truck when 2 state troopers attempted to stop him for alleged perception of defects present in the pickup truck. They managed to get Draga to pull over in La Pearl's IGA supermarket parking lot. But when Trooper Scott Phillips and Les Lord approached the vehicle, the armed man drew his weapon and fired at both of them, swiftly ending their lives. This marked the start of his almost unexpected slaying spree. After stealing the police cruiser, Draga headed to Vicky Bonnell's office, a former selectman turned part-time lawyer. Allegedly, Bonnell carried a firearm in her purse purely out of fear of Draga. When she saw the homicidal maniac arrive at the office, she ordered for him to leave the building before heading out the back door. But Draga also headed to the back of the office, where he filed upon Bonnell. Working next door was the editor of the Colebrook News and Sentinel, Dennis Jews, who became an unintended victim of the spree. He launched himself toward Draga, tackling him, but even with the weight of a full-grown man, he continued to walk, eventually drawing the firearm on Jews, ending his life. From there, the assailant headed to Bloomfield, Vermont, where he fired upon Fish and Game Warden Wayne Saunders, sending his car veering off the road. Saunders survived the attack. The harrowing slaying spree would come to an end when police discovered the abandoned cruiser, only to be wounded by a hail of lead. Positioned on a nearby hill was Draga, still adamant to claim more lives. But even though he wounded more troopers, the firefight ultimately claimed his own life. By the end of it, the 62-year-old carpenter had claimed 4 lives, scarring the New Hampshire community with his unexpected homicidal rampage, driven by simmering property right grievances. Serving as an indelible chapter in Indonesia's history were the distressing events of May 1998. It was a time marked by exhaustive struggle and grief that still resonates in the community today. It was then that the community had reached its breaking point, a result of years of tensions between Chinese Indonesians and native Indonesians. Adding to the conflict was the Suharto regime, or the New Order as it had been named. This referred to the authoritarian rule of President Suharto, which began in 1967. It was characterized by a frustrating military presence, suppression, and political disputes. Serving as the cherry on top was the 1997 Asian financial crisis that severely destabilized Asia's economy, initially beginning in Thailand before spreading to the neighboring economies. All these aspects eventually culminated together, triggering explosions across Indonesia that would become known as the May 1998 Indonesia riots, or the 1998 tragedy. Mass violence and civil unrest ran rampant throughout the country. The unrest targets the ethnic Chinese population, taking place in Medan, Jakarta, and Surakarta. At the beginning of the riots, Medan saw student demonstrations, following the increase in gasoline prices and sudden tripling of the cost of electricity. Tear gas and authoritative pushback led to the demise and even more unrest. Molotovs were used to keep the protesters at bay, and security officials barricaded the campus to stop them from leaving. Groups of students were also assaulted by these forces. One day after the Medan unrest ended, it began in Jakarta, which had the worst of it. Students threw rocks at police who were firing at the demonstrations as they staged a sit-in outside the campus gates. By the 12th of May, 10,000 students have flocked to Trisakti University, becoming the site of their demonstrations. Again, the security forces prevented them from leaving, and chaos ensued. This time it claimed 4 lives, 3 more than it had in Medan's riots. The unrest in Jakarta raged for 2 days. Once it ended, the student protests sparked once more in Surakarta, seeing similar characteristics of pure chaos. Violence was rife, mixed with rubber bullets, tear gas canisters, and the launch of whatever objects the student protesters could get their hands on. The demonstrations in each of these places weren't limited to the universities. Rioters had taken to the streets, seeking out Chinese-owned businesses and temples, burning the cars and looting the cities. Shops were burned to the ground, while offices and banks were damaged by rock throwing and defaced by other means of destruction. Any person who identified themselves as Chinese was at an immediate risk of demise. By the end of it, an estimated mortality toll of 1,188 was reported. with over 100 Chinese women reporting they'd been assaulted. Thousands of victims of the 1998 tragedy were subjected to being burned or beaten, often until they stopped breathing. And all of this was in protest of the new order and presence of the 2% of Chinese Indonesians. Ending the decade of the 90s, defining its disturbing nature, was one last brutal act committed by a notorious maniac whose thievery and petty crimes manifested into something far more disturbing: homicide. Donald Bounds started life in rural Oregon and grew up in Olympia, Washington, where he would find work as a butcher later in life. Before the age of 20, Bounds was already exhibiting tendencies of crime, having already done jail time for stealing firearms. Despite this poor start to adulthood, he found love, got married, and moved to Lake Havasu, Arizona. Unfortunately, his rehabilitation didn't last long. In 1997, his violent tendencies surfaced, and he was arrested for domestic violence. The following year, he started over in Tucson, but was charged with disorderly conduct. It seemed that wherever Bounds went, unrest was sure to follow. In 1999, he headed to Greenville, South Carolina, where he moved in with friends that June, the very month that the Greenville homicides would begin. On the 26th of June, 1999, Bounds headed to the Radio Shack where he allegedly jabbed a screwdriver into Jonathan Lara's neck and zip-tied him to a chair. Strangely, there were no signs of a struggle and nothing was taken. Police were baffled by the lack of evidence, sending them on a months-long quest for answers. In the meantime, by the 22nd of December that year, Bounds had his eyes set on his next target. That day, he entered the Greenville Pelham Florist and attacked Karen Hayden. The assailant drew a blade and ran it across the victim's throat, ending her life. By this time, police were closing in on Bounds, and he was named a prime suspect. But police weren't able to arrest him just yet due to a lack of evidence. Realizing that his gate for unyielding slaughter was closing, Bounds made one final endeavor. On the 23rd of December, 1999, he followed his ex-girlfriend, Sandra Roberts Ott, to her home. It wasn't established if the two had interacted there, but Sandra had texted her ex-husband the message 911, indicating that she was in danger and that she wasn't able to call the police herself. That message was delivered at around 1:30 that morning. Sandra rushed from her apartment and hurried to her ex-husband's home in Easley, wearing no shoes and leaving the apartment wide open. Bounds followed Sandra all the way there and broke in through a window. Once the woman and her ex, Timothy, realized there was someone in the house, they tried to establish control of the ordeal. But before they could defend themselves, Bounds already had a firearm pointed at them. Sandra tried to save Timothy by getting into a physical struggle with the assailant, which resulted in her being fatally wounded. Timothy fled the scene and tried to make it to the neighbor's house, but Bounds was trailing swiftly behind him. The rampaging maniac hid in several homes for the next 12 hours as a manhunt ensued. He took 2 hostages during this time, but left them unharmed. Eventually, the spree came to an end when he took matters into his own hands, realizing there was no way out of this. Subsequently, investigators were able to tie him to the previous homicides, and he was named the Monster of Greenville. Christmas came 2 days later, and soon the disturbing decade was at its end, but not without many unwanted memories to look back on. One of the most prominent and disturbing moments of the 1980s occurred on the 13th of May, 1981, when an assassin attempted to end the life of the then leader of the Catholic Church, Pope John Paul II. To this day, no one is quite sure why 23-year-old Mehmet Ali Agca decided to enact this murderous plot, and many theories have been suggested, including the fact that this was the first non-Catholic pope in more than 456 years, but Agca's reasons remain a mystery. What's known about him is that during the 1970s, he became a member of the right-wing Turkish group called the Grey Wolves, which ended the lives of many activists, politicians, and journalists. It also later came to light that he was responsible for ending the life of a newspaper editor called Abdi Ipeki in 1979, and for that crime he was quickly arrested. But while he was incarcerated and awaiting his trial, he somehow managed to escape. When his cell phone was searched, prison guards found a strange note in which he spoke about the Pope and his planned visit to Turkey. He claimed that he was entering the country under the guise of a religious leader, and he demanded that the trip be called off. He further threatened that if this wasn't done, he would end the Pope's life. He added that he escaped from prison for this sole reason, but this did little to dissuade the Pope from carrying out his plans. Fortunately, the visit went ahead without incident, but Agca remained a free man on the run. In 1981, he used fake documentation to travel to Italy, and he booked into a hotel near the Vatican. On the 13th of May, he was ready to make good on his threat, and he walked into St. Peter's Square, where he produced a firearm, aimed it at the Pope, and fired 4 times. The Pope was struck twice, once in the abdomen and once in the hand. 2 bystanders, Anne Andre and Rose Hill, were also injured, but they were both rushed to a hospital and made full recoveries. Bystanders who witnessed the assassination attempt swamped Agca and wrenched the weapon out of his hands. He was detained by members of the public until the police arrived and he was taken into custody. The Pope was seriously wounded, and so he was taken to Gemelli Hospital in Rome, where he was listed as being in critical condition. As soon as he arrived, he was rushed into an operating room, where surgeons successfully worked for more than 5 hours to save his life. Following this, his condition was changed to stable, and his followers breathed a sigh of relief. When Agca was arrested and searched, another note was discovered on his person, in which he proclaimed that he had attempted to assassinate the Pope in protest of the Soviet Union, America, and events that were occurring in Salvador and Afghanistan. The stock market can be unpredictable at the best of times, and it has on several occasions caused a lot of people to lose their entire life savings in a matter of hours or even minutes. One of the worst crashes concerning the stock market occurred in 1987, and it's still spoken about today. The incident, known today as Black Monday, took place on the 19th of October, 1987, when the stock market dropped by more than 22% and the S&P 500 index by more than 20%, which was unprecedented. But many traders had seen the imminent crash when earlier the Dow Jones dropped by just 6.5% in 2 days. A day later, it dropped by another 5% in London, England's market, and many people started to feel uneasy about the days ahead. The devastating crash started on Monday morning, the 19th of October. The first signs appeared in Hong Kong, and soon it spread through other parts of the Asian continent while trading was ongoing. Soon, the crash spread through Europe when the London stock market opened for the day. And later that day, when the US market opened, stocks were plummeting at an incredible rate, sending traders and their clients into a frenzy. This continued for the rest of the trading day, and when markets finally closed, the DJIA had dropped by over 500 points, and the S&P fell by 55 points. Many people were left devastated and believed they'd been ruined financially. Very quickly, speculation started as to what caused the crash. Some analysts believed that it was the result of a strong bull market that had been in need of correction, since no such corrections had been made for more than 5 years. Others blamed computerized trading for the incident, since it was a new concept and many traders still felt uncomfortable with the idea. Thanks to these systems, the failing stocks resulted in a cascade of further crashes brought about by continuous accelerated selling, which was caused by falling stocks in the first place. This caused stock prices to plummet, which then only resulted in more accelerated selling, and so forth. Another suggested cause was the short selling of stocks by institutional investors, which placed further strain on the market and resulted in yet another domino effect. But most experts today agree that the crash was likely the result of a combination of these factors, including overvalued stocks that were never collected, and an accelerated drop in stock prices thanks to computerized trading. One factor that most world leaders have to take into account is that they'll never be popular in everyone's eyes, and this unpopularity might result in radicals attempting to end their lives. Throughout history, many US presidents have been targeted by hitmen, and some, including Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, ended up losing their lives as a result. But luckily, not all of these attempts were successful, and a good example of this was the attempted assassination of ex-President Ronald Reagan, which occurred on the 30th of March, 1981. On that day, Reagan had visited the Washington Hilton Hotel, where he attended and spoke at a union meeting. He was no stranger to the hotel, since its ballroom was often used to host the annual White House Correspondents' Association dinner. After completing his speech, reporters gathered at the hotel entrance in hopes of speaking to Reagan when his attacker struck. When he finally emerged from the building in good spirits, he walked to his limousine, which was parked nearby, but then a man named John Hinckley Jr. produced a firearm while standing in the crowd, and he opened fire with the aim of ending Reagan's life. The first people to react were Special Agent in Charge Jerry Parr and Assistant to the Special Agent in Charge Ray Shattuck. The two men immediately grabbed Reagan and pushed him towards his limousine, eventually managing to get him into the vehicle. The driver then sped away. While fleeing, the two men inspected the president and made a worrying discovery. He'd been wounded, and biological material was seen on his mouth. The driver was ordered to drive to the George Washington University Hospital, where the wound was inspected and surgery began. The projectile was successfully removed, and Reagan started his road to recovery. But he wasn't the only one injured in the attack. The first shot that was fired hit White House Press Secretary James Brady above his left eye. Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy and Metropolitan Police Officer Thomas Delante were also struck, and McCarthy, as well as Brady, were taken to the same hospital as the president, where they received treatment and were eventually released days later. McCarthy suffered the worst injury out of the group, and initially it was reported that he had succumbed to his wounds, but this was later corrected by news outlets. But the initial reports drew a lot of criticism from the public, and seasoned reporters were outraged by such reckless speculation being reported as fact. It was later discovered that Reagan wasn't hit directly, since one of the projectiles hit his limousine and then ricocheted towards him, hitting him under his left arm and grazing one of his ribs. Special Agent Dennis McCarthy managed to subdue the would-be assassin by diving on top of him, while the president and his men fled. In the days that followed, speculation ran rife as to what Hinckley's motive was, and it would then come to light that he was suffering from severe mental issues and that he had developed a potent obsession with actress Jodie Foster. Quite unbelievably, he became convinced that if he was successful in ending Reagan's life, Foster would be so impressed by his efforts that she would fall in love with him. The Summer Olympic Games are supposed to be an event that showcases the abilities of athletes from around the world in their respective disciplines, but the games held in 1980 took a different turn. In 1979, the Soviet government announced its plans to invade Afghanistan, and in December of that year, they made good on that threat. Since this occurred during the ongoing Cold War, the United States immediately decided to take action, and then President Jimmy Carter announced that the US would be boycotting the 1980 Olympic Games that would be held in Moscow. In one address made by Carter, he stated that the invasion of Afghanistan could have a serious impact on the rest of the world, since it could result in the biggest threat to world peace since the outbreak of the World War II. Back then, 2,400 people sat on the US Olympic Committee House of Delegates, and more than 66% of its members agreed that the boycott should go ahead as planned. This meant that no US athletes would get the chance to compete at the Games, but many people believed this to be a mistake. For a very long time, athletes have lamented the fact that politicians use sports as a means to further their own policies, when many athletes have no interest in such issues. Furthermore, the athletes who were set to compete at the Games were left confused, as many were never even briefed on the reasons for the boycott. While the move was seen by many as a good idea, since it made the US's stance clear, others recognized that it would have long-lasting effects on the athletes who trained for years to get a chance to earn an Olympic medal. 474 US athletes had qualified for the Games, but were left despondent when they were told that they had no say in the matter, and that they would have to wait at least another 4 years to get another chance at Olympic victory. Unfortunately, out of those 474 athletes, 227 would never qualify again, and their chance was squandered forever. Recognizing that the boycott had a massive drop in morale among the athletes, they were invited to meet Carter at the White House, and there they received the Congressional Gold Medal, but this was seen as a poor substitute for an Olympic medal. Furthermore, none of these athletes were recognized in the congressional record until 30 years later, when the US government was pressured into doing so. It would later come to light that Carter decided to boycott the games thanks to the advice of the National Security Advisor, who suggested that he implement a zero-tolerance policy against the Soviet Union. It's virtually impossible to discuss Australia without mentioning its abundant wildlife. It contains some truly unique animals, many of which are very dangerous, but one small animal, the mouse, has caused a lot of damage in the country over the years, as Australia has repeatedly battled with mouse plagues, one of the largest of which occurred in 1984. The latest mouse plague to hit Australia took place in 2021, and almost immediately, footage from the 1984 plague surfaced online, painting a horrific picture of what it was like to live in those conditions decades ago. One crop farmer, a man named John Goldsmith, has stated that the 1984 plague was the worst he had ever lived through. He owned a farm in Malali in northwest New South Wales, and he would often travel on the road between Malali and Gunnedah. This road would often contain so many mice that it was eventually nicknamed the Felt Highway. Motorists couldn't tell the difference between the road's surface and the rodents that were present on it, and had to drive on a road of mice that either refused or were unable to move, even when heavy vehicles approached. Before long, the plague started having a serious effect on the country's produce and economy. The mice would find their ways into silos, where they would eat everything in sight. Goldsmith added that when he went to bed at night, he would set up a mousetrap in his house, and when he woke up in the morning, 3 or 4 mice would be stuck in the same trap. Along with these rodents came an unbearable stench, thanks to the droppings that they left behind, and the decomposing remains of mice that had perished, either of natural causes, in traps, or under the wheels of vehicles. It's believed that the cause of the plague was a break in a long drought that the country had experienced. As soon as it started raining, the mice found that food sources were suddenly abundant, and hence they started multiplying at an alarming rate. With the increase in their numbers, they needed to find even more food, and so they started entering people's houses, barns, and silos, and started wreaking havoc on crops that had been planted. One of the main issues was that the mice were able to start breeding when they were only 6 weeks old, and each litter can contain up to 10 mice at a time. Furthermore, each female can produce a new litter every month, and before long, the number of hungry mice skyrocketed. In just one round of breeding, each 100 mice could multiply to 600, and those 600 would then also breed, resulting in thousands of new mice, and the cycle continued unabated despite farmers' best efforts to curb their numbers by any means necessary, including the use of flamethrowers. Some people reported that during the first few days of the plague, they would see cats and predatory birds feasting on the mice, but just a few days later they had their fill and quickly started losing interest. The plague eventually came to an end 6 months later, not thanks to human ingenuity, but a shift in weather conditions when the Australian summer neared its end. It started raining more often, and temperatures started to drop dramatically, and the economy was finally able to recover. California is mostly known for the famous movie stars and musicians that live there, particularly in the Los Angeles area. But it also contains a hidden threat in the form of the San Andreas Fault Line, which runs through a 74-mile stretch of the city. Many people believe that the area is overdue for a massive earthquake, since the last notable quake occurred there in 2004, when a magnitude 6.0 tremor hit. In the wake of another quake, a magnitude 6.7 that took place in the San Fernando Valley in 1997. Many locals seemingly forgot about another earthquake that took place in the 80s, and which was responsible for ending the lives of 8 people. This is likely due to the fact that the Whittier Narrows earthquake wasn't caused by the San Andreas Fault Line, but the Puente Hills Blind Thrust Fault, which lies directly beneath Los Angeles. In 1987, the fault had not yet been discovered, and hence when an earthquake measuring 5.9 on the Richter scale struck at 7:42 a.m. on the 1st of October that year, no one was prepared. One man recalls being on a bus on his way to school when he and his fellow students heard a different bus driver's voice over their bus's radio system. That driver reported that he was experiencing an earthquake on his route, but when the students looked out of their windows, they couldn't see anything out of place. That is until a few seconds later, when that very ground started to convulse, traffic lights started to sway back and forth, and the bus started to rock from side to side. People would later report that the quake was incredibly loud, with some describing it as the sound of a freight train passing through their houses. The epicenter of the quake was determined to have originated close to the Whittier Narrows Nature Center, and hence it was nicknamed the Whittier Narrows earthquake. People ran for cover, fearing that buildings would start tumbling down at any moment, and motorists were forced to pull over in the midst of the chaos. The tremors lasted for about 20 seconds, but locals stated that it felt much longer since they feared for their lives throughout. When the tremors finally ended, the time came for the damage to be assessed. Several homes and businesses were impacted. Roadways in Los Angeles and Orange County were damaged, and 8 people lost their lives. Whittier and Alhambra suffered some of the worst structural damage, as several unreinforced buildings had either collapsed completely or had started cracking and were now deemed too dangerous to enter. Some residents reported that their garages had collapsed, that windows in their houses had shattered, and that their chimneys had cracked. Thousands of people had to be taken to the hospital to be treated for injuries, and many businesses were forced to close their doors until repairs could be made. When all was said and done, it was estimated that the quake had resulted in about $358 million worth of damage, and many people were unable to return home. Many of us find the subject of cults to be fascinating, since we struggle to understand why anyone would choose to become a member of such a group. Furthermore, cults often subscribe to some very strange beliefs, usually thanks to the beliefs of their leader. And once someone joins a cult, it's usually very hard, if not impossible, to leave. One of the most famous cults to ever exist was the People's Temple, which was created by leader Jim Jones in the 1950s. The cult preached a combination of Christian principles blended with communist ideals, and Jones was seen as a divine figure of sorts. Those who joined the cult practiced communal living, during which the members would share in each other's belongings, ensuring that everyone was treated equally. But as the years passed, Jones grew ever more paranoid, and a sense of fear started to permeate throughout the cult, and its members were forbidden from leaving. In 1969, Elmer and Dina Mills decided to join Jones and his followers. They were quickly accepted, and before long started working their way up the ranks. Dina was placed in charge of the temple's publications office, and Elmer served as the group's official photographer. They soon gained Jones's trust, and they were entrusted with certain unsavory tasks, such as screening the rest of the members' mail. On one occasion, they intercepted a letter written by a 19-year-old member of her family, and Jones then used its contents to convince her that he could read her mind. During this time, the couple allowed the temple to manage 3 properties that they owned in California, and this soon resulted in their relationship with Jones deteriorating. Jones had decided that the properties now belonged to him, and Elmer and Dina were now forced to change their names to avoid the power of attorney that Jones had over the real estate. As a result, they decided to abscond from the cult in 1975, and as soon as they did so, they changed their names to Al and Jeannie Mills. This was done not only to protect their properties, but also out of fear, since they were certain that Jones and his followers would look for them and enact revenge of some kind. Free from the cult, the couple started speaking out about the atrocities that they'd witnessed at the hands of Jones and the rest of the cult. They created the Human Freedom Center, which was open to any other defectors from the temple, and they started supporting those who opposed Jones and who sought to expose him for the charlatan that he was. Jones stated that he would find a way to retaliate against Al and Jeannie, but tragedy would strike at the compound when most of Jones's followers, more than 900 people, lost their lives on the 18th of November, 1978. When the couple received news of the tragedy, they offered the Human Freedom Center as a haven for those who survived, and they started relaying information about Jones and his nefarious activities to the FBI. Jeannie became even more vocal about her time in the cult and gave several talks on the subject at universities and public meetings. It was believed that the cult had imploded and was no longer a threat, but in February of 1980, it became apparent that this was not the case. On the 27th of February, it's believed that an ex-member of the People's Temple entered the couple's home and ended their lives along with that of their daughter. For some time, it was believed that their son Eddie was responsible, but he was eventually released without any charges being brought against him. The The Jonestown incident is one that echoed throughout the 1980s, and which has brought dangers of cults to the fore in the worst possible way. Singer Rusty Day, whose real name was Russell Edward Davidson, joined the rock group Cactus after leaving Tim Nugent's The American Amboy Dukes in 1969. Nugent would later state that he decided to fire Day since he'd become addicted to illegal substances, and that his behavior was having a negative impact on the rest of the band. Day played on just one of the band's albums before being fired, and the following year he was asked to become the vocalist for Cactus. Initially, Jeff Beck and Rod Stewart were included in the band's lineup, but Beck suffered injuries in a car accident, and Stewart decided to join a band called The Faces instead. Hence, Day took over the vocal duties, while Jim McCarthy became their new guitarist. The band managed to produce 3 albums, but then Day was fired once again shortly after McCarthy quit, thanks to disagreements with other members. But he'd become well known in Detroit as a vocalist of immense talent, and he decided to try to resurrect one of the then best-known bands in the area, the band Detroit, which was an offshoot of another band called the Detroit Wheels, but the project didn't fare too well. In 1976, Day started a different version of Cactus in Florida after he'd relocated to Longwood. He recruited Steve Dansby on guitar, John Sauter on bass guitar, and Gary Moffett as their drummer. The band continued to produce music for the next 3 years, the longest 1970s version of Cactus to ever exist, but they decided to call it quits in 1979. Day claimed that he was contacted by the heavy metal band AC/DC in 1980, after their vocalist Bon Scott passed away, and he was asked to become their new singer. He also claimed that he was offered the same role by the Rossington Collins Band after their vocalist Ronnie Van Zant passed away in a plane crash. According to Day, he turned down both offers, but many people are skeptical of these claims, with some suggesting that Day was lying. He then formed a band called Uncle Acid and the Permanent Damage, and in 1980, they were offered a record deal by Epic Records. But on the 6th of March, 1982, tragedy struck. At the time, Day had become involved in dealing illegal substances, while the band was in the process of recording an album. On that day, a group of armed men entered Day's house and ended his life, along with that of his son, and Garth McRae, who was visiting the singer. It's believed that the attack was the result of a deal that had gone wrong, but to this day, many believe that Ron Sanders, the band's guitarist, was responsible, but this has never been proven. Today, Day is remembered as one of the pioneers of the Detroit rock scene, and his murder remains unsolved. Christopher Dale Flannery was born in Brunswick in Melbourne, Australia, in 1949. When he turned 14, he decided to stop attending school and instead became a career criminal. He was first arrested at the age of 16 when he was charged with housebreaking, vehicle theft, assault of a police officer, and possession of illegal firearms. He spent the next 7 years in prison, and in 1974, he once again found himself on the wrong side of the law, when he and 2 other men were arrested for armed robbery in Sydney. He was extradited to Perth, but was acquitted on the charge, after, according to speculation, bribing the arresting officer, Detective Sergeant Roger Rogerson. He was arrested on a separate matter and spent another stint in jail. As soon as he was released, Flannery started working as a bouncer at Mickey's Disco in St. Kilda, but he soon found the work to be too monotonous and instead decided to try his hand at being a hitman. The first life that he claimed was that of barrister Roger Anthony Wilson. He and 2 other men, Mark Alfred Clarkson and John Henry Williams, were arrested for the hit, but Flannery was acquitted once again. But as soon as he left the courtroom, he found a group of New South Wales detectives waiting outside, and they arrested him for ending the life of Raymond Loxley, who owned a brothel in Sydney. Quite unbelievably, Flannery was acquitted again, and he decided to relocate to Arncliffe along with his wife and children. Once there, he started working as a bodyguard for a well-known criminal called George Freeman. By 1984, the Sydney Gangland War had broken out, and Flannery was caught in the middle of the chaos. It's said that he became increasingly paranoid and would end the life of anyone whom he suspected of being associated with Barry McCann or Tom Domican, who were working with rival gangs. It's believed that Flannery was then responsible for attempting to end the life of undercover agent Mick Drury, who in reality was a member of the Sydney police force, but it was never proven. On the 27th of January, 1985, Flannery's house was targeted by persons unknown who fired at the building 30 times. The attempt on his life was unsuccessful, but he suffered a few minor injuries, and Tom Domigan was arrested over the incident but was later acquitted. In April of that year, it's alleged that Flannery was ordered by Freeman to end the life of Tony Eustace. Eustace was attacked with a firearm and found severely injured next to his car. While receiving treatment in a hospital, he was visited by detectives who asked him to reveal the name of his attacker, but he refused and passed away shortly after. Flannery decided to relocate once more, and he moved to the Connaught Building, which was situated close to the Australian Criminal Investigation Branch headquarters. On the 9th of May, he was contacted by Freeman, who asked him to attend a meeting. As he prepared to leave, he found that his car wouldn't start, and Freeman instructed him to take a taxi instead. He left the house to do so, but he was never seen again. Criminal Nettie Smith would later state that Flannery was offered a ride by 2 detectives whom he knew, and he accepted. When the car reached a set of traffic lights, Smith claims that 2 more officers got into the car and ended his life with a firearm. This remains mere speculation, though, since Flannery's body was never found and no suspects have ever been identified in his disappearance. On the 10th of February, she finished her shift at the Fashion Bar clothing store, where she was employed as a sales clerk. But when she reached her apartment, she remembered that she'd given her keys to her part-time roommate, Sharon DeConnick. She was locked out since Sharon had had too much to drink at a local bar, and after falling asleep in the apartment, she couldn't be woken up. Peggy decided to visit a few bars, and on several occasions tried calling her apartment, but got no answer. At around midnight, she finally managed to wake Sharon and was able to get into her apartment. She then changed her clothes and headed out once more. She's known to have visited the Prime Minister Pub and Grill, where she ran into her boyfriend. She spent some time there, but at around 1:15 a.m., she likely decided to head home, but never made it there. Later that morning, a cyclist noticed a trail of biological material leading from a curb into a field, and after following it, he found Peggy deceased on the ground along the 3800 block of South Landings Drive. He informed the police, who determined she'd been attacked with a sharpened blade. Sharon was the first to be interviewed, and after confirming that Peggy had been seeing several men, she mentioned the name of a man named Derek, whom she'd met at the Laughing Dog Saloon. Peggy's regular roommate, Barb Kohler, who was out of town at the time of the attack, also mentioned this man, and revealed that after he and Peggy met, he told her that he was planning on living in a tent with one of his friends. Several more people mentioned the man, but added that they never learned his name, though one friend stated that Peggy apparently no longer wanted to see him, since he'd been pestering her with phone calls and unplanned visits. On one occasion, Peggy's friend, Timothy Matthews, was staying over at her apartment when the man turned up unexpectedly again and asked Matthews to lock the door since she didn't want to talk to him. He was described as being in his mid-20s and standing about 6 feet tall with a husky build, and having what they described as longish blonde or strawberry blonde hair. At the crime scene, photos, plaster casts, and measurements were taken of Peggy's attacker's shoe prints, and they were believed to have been bought at the Tom McCann store in Foothills Fashion Mall. One of the prints was found to be a match for sneakers worn by a teenager named Timothy Masters, and he was arrested. He was found guilty of ending Peggy's life, but after spending a decade in prison, he was exonerated when DNA evidence proved that he wasn't the culprit. Peggy's attacker was never identified, and her case remains a mystery to this day. As the 1990s drew to a close, people all over the world were preparing to usher in a new millennium with great excitement. Some of the biggest ever New Year's Eve parties are being organized, and a sense of revelry hung in the air, but it was tinged with an air of apprehension thanks to one possible problem: the Y2K bug. Y2K is an abbreviation for year 2000, and the bug that was being referenced had to do with the computer systems the world over. During the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, computer programmers were in the habit of using a 2-digit code for the year in which their programs were created. For example, rather than using the full year, such as 1987, they would simply use the last 2 numbers, 87. This saved on data storage, and no one had foreseen that this method would create a problem in the future. Then, as the new millennium neared, they realized that computer systems may not realize that the digits 00 denoted a new millennium, and they would reset to 1900 rather than the year 2000. Thus, it was feared that any computerized tasks that were scheduled to be completed on a daily or yearly basis would be adversely affected or even damaged. One of the largest sectors that was thought to be under threat was banking, since computers needed to calculate interest rates and update them daily. If the Y2K bug were to affect these systems, interest rates would be calculated at minus 100 years, rather than adjusting for a single day. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. Many other sectors were affected, such as nuclear power plants that rely on computer systems to perform automated safety checks. At airports, computer systems that contained scheduled flights were thought to be at risk, as were other parts of the financial sector. Before long, people started spreading rumors that if the bug wasn't fixed in time, it would cause electricity grids to collapse across the globe. Planes would start falling from the sky, and we would return to a state akin to times before we had computers. In response, the governments of the world tried to assure their citizens that the problem was being dealt with, and the 2000 Information and Readiness Disclosure Act was passed. This allowed programmers around the world to share information on the bug and what was being done to curtail it. It also aimed to prevent lawsuits related to false information being spread about the bug through limited liability. The result was a mad dash as programmers started checking systems in order to identify any possible issues so that they could be addressed before the new year arrived. But it came to light that governments, both local and state, were ill-prepared for the problem and were having a hard time catching up. Military units were told to be at the ready, as were police forces and first responders, as it was feared that looting might occur should power grids go down as the result of the bug. In the US alone, more than $150 billion was spent on Y2K readiness, and the total global cost was estimated at around $300 billion. But when the new millennium arrived, almost no problems were reported. Soon, rumors started to spread that there was no threat to begin with, and that the entire Y2K bug issue was an exercise in futility. But it was soon revealed that the threat was very real, and thanks to the collective efforts of programmers around the world, computer systems that had been upgraded were running smoother than ever before. When talking about figure skating, most of us envision graceful skaters who've honed their routines to be as perfect as possible. But it is, however, an extremely competitive sport, as skaters with immense talent are continually vying for the top spot. And on one occasion, one particular skater did all she could to ensure victory. In 1994, US skaters were competing for a spot on the United States Olympic team. As one might imagine, competition was fierce, but two particular skaters, Tanya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan, were embroiled in a heated rivalry, as Harding had beaten Kerrigan at the 1991 US Figure Skating Championships. She then came second at the ISU World Championships, while Kerrigan placed third. That same year, Harding completed a triple axel and became the first woman to ever do so. Their fierce rivalry continued, and still very much alive on the 6th of January, 1994, while both women were preparing to compete in the Olympics. Kerrigan had stepped off the ice after completing a practice run for the national championships that were being held the following night, and was walking down a corridor in the Cobo Arena in Detroit, Michigan, when the unthinkable happened. Cameras captured the aftermath as Kerrigan could be heard screaming in pain, and when bystanders rushed to her aid, she was found sitting on the floor clutching her right leg, repeatedly asking, "Why me?" It would then come to light that someone had snuck up behind her and used a telescope baton to strike her in the leg in an obvious effort to end her Olympic dream. While the injury didn't result in any fractures, it was severe enough to cause her to pull out of the national championships. Harding would go on to compete at the event, and she walked away with the gold medal 2 days later. This ensured her a spot at the Winter Olympics that were being held in Norway that same year. But in the aftermath of the attack against Kerrigan, the FBI launched an investigation. They questioned Harding's bodyguard, Sean Eckert, and on the 12th of January, he confessed to being involved in the incident, but quickly pointed the finger at Jeff Gillooly, Harding's ex-husband Shane Stant, and his uncle Derek Smith, stating that Smith drove the getaway vehicle. Everyone involved, other than Harding, had been arrested, and it was decided that she could still compete in the Olympics, since no evidence had been found yet that she knew about the attack before it happened. Gillooly was found to be the one who orchestrated the plan, and he surrendered to the police. But only 4 days later, he found out that a warrant for his arrest had been issued. When he was questioned, he stated that Harding knew about the attack, and he confirmed the involvement of his accomplices. Eventually, Harding was handed a $160,000 fine and placed on probation for 3 years. Her national championship title was revoked, and she received a lifetime ban from the United States Figure Skating Association. Usually, when someone reports a sighting of a UFO, there's only one or maybe a handful of witnesses. But one event that occurred in Michigan in 1994 was the exception, as hundreds of people came forward to report that they'd seen something very strange in the sky on the 8th of March of that year. An editor and sports writer for the Holland Sentinel, Lee Lambert, reported that he had attended a basketball game and had just left Holland High School. He was the last to exit the building that night when he became aware of a strange humming sound. Since the school is located close to an airport, he assumed it was the sound of a plane approaching, but when he looked up, he was astonished to see a long road of red and white lights hovering in the sky above the building. He stated that the lights hovered about 100 feet above the ground and that they were moving slowly before moving out of sight. When he told his colleagues at his office about the experience, they didn't take him seriously. About 20 miles away, a woman named Cindy Pravda also saw the lights as she peered out of her kitchen window while she was talking with someone on the phone. She described seeing 4 lights rather than a row and described them as being the same size as the moon in the night sky from her perspective. The lights that she saw were arranged in a circle and were hovering just above a nearby tree line. They remained in that area for the next 15 minutes before one of the lights moved away. The other 3 disappeared behind the tree line 15 minutes later. An investigative reporter for the Muskegon Chronicle, Mike Walsh, managed to get his hands on the 911 recordings from that night, and he's the first to admit that he was skeptical about the sightings that had been reported. But once he started listening to the recordings, he realized that something strange had indeed happened that night. Some stated that the lights formed a V shape in the sky, while others described them as an oval shape. Some saw rows of light like Lambert had, while other witnesses only saw 2 or 3 lights. Others reported seeing 5 or 6 lights moving back and forth or blinking in unison. A police officer decided to contact the National Weather Service field office at Muskegon County Airport to inquire whether they'd picked up anything on their radar systems, and they reported something very unusual. One operator caught 3 objects that were not supposed to be flying in the area. The objects changed in altitude at impossible speed, but were remaining in formation, and eventually they flew over Lake Michigan and were lost on the radar system. The incident was covered by news outlets, and several witnesses were interviewed, but the objects were never positively identified. More than 300 people reported seeing the lights that night, and it's still considered one of the holy grails of UFO encounters in the US. We've grown accustomed to seeing videos and live footage of high-speed police chases on television, but this was not always the case. Before 1992, no such chase had ever been broadcast live, and on the 3rd of January that year, the world witnessed such an incident for the first time. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, the KCOP Channel 13 station was set to show a rerun of an episode of Matlock, but it was interrupted, and viewers were informed that the police were in pursuit of a man who was driving a red Volkswagen Cabriolet convertible. He was being chased by a line of police officers in their patrol cars at speeds of around 75 miles per hour. They were traveling along Interstate 5, and 400 feet above them, a news helicopter piloted by Bob Turr was following events as they unfolded. Footage was being captured by Turr's wife, Marika, who had a camera trained on the fleeing vehicle. It would then come to light that the man in the convertible was 22-year-old Darren Michael Stroh, who'd picked up a hitchhiker earlier that day. After a short distance, though, his car broke down, and he pulled over, trying to flag down passing motorists. 26-year-old Davis Scott decided to pull over, and he tried to jumpstart the car without success. He started walking back to his own car, but Stroh then produced a firearm and ended his life without provocation. He asked if the hitchhiker would like to join him in Scott's car, but he understandably decided to flee instead. After driving away, Stroh collided with the convertible about an hour later, close to Coalinga. He then stole that vehicle and fled once more, after which the police were informed, and as a result, the television chase started. When Bob and Marika heard about the chase while monitoring a rainstorm in their helicopter, they decided to give chase from the air. In the meantime, Stroh was weaving in and out of traffic and putting countless lives in danger in an effort to escape the pursuing officers. He fired his weapon at them, tried to shake them off at off-ramps, and eventually ended up on the 170 before driving onto the 101. He then drove through Hollywood and caused further danger by driving onto sidewalks and continuing to drive erratically. The chase was now being broadcast live on the air, and when Stroh reached the Westminster off-ramp, the car he was driving came to a halt, having run out of gas. Officers blocked the path behind him, and they shouted orders at him, but he refused to drop his firearm. Feeling that he had no other option, one officer broke cover and fired at the vehicle, hitting it several times. Stroh was also hit, and when officers felt that it was safe, they approached the car. There, they found that Stroh had been fatally wounded. It was then revealed the next day that the chase had seen record ratings as viewers had gotten word of the broadcast and remained glued to their screens until the drama had come to an end. Thus began the trend of televised police chases, and in the opinion of many, the advent of reality television. The Satanic Panic was a phenomenon that started in the 1980s and carried well into the 90s after a book entitled Michelle Remembers, which is written by a Canadian psychiatrist named Lawrence Pazder, and his wife and former patient Michelle Smith, was published. In the book, Pazder recounts some of the sessions that he had with Michelle, during which they engaged in repressed memory therapy. This was done after Michelle stated she had something important to tell him, but the memory eluded her. During one session, Michelle started screaming and didn't stop for another 25 minutes. She then started speaking in the voice of a small child, and for the next year, she revealed under hypnosis that she'd been abused by a satanic cult that her mother belonged to. As soon as the book was published, it started selling well all over the world. No one seemingly bothered to question the events recounted by Michelle, and before long, thousands of people started fearing that they'd be abducted by similar cults, and that Satanists were doing everything in their power to recruit more members to their church. This was only exacerbated by the fact that dairy companies started placing photos of missing children on the sides of milk cartons to draw attention to their cases. And since the public just became aware of how many children had gone missing, they started to blame Satanism. The truth was that many of the children featured in this way had run away from home for different reasons, and others were caught in the middle of bitter custody disputes in which one of their parents kept them from seeing the other, often by moving to an unknown area. Then there were some preachers who condemned tabletop games such as Dungeons & Dragons. They claimed that these games were designed to influence teenagers who played them, and that they acted as a type of gateway for more nefarious activities. Some preachers started informing their congregations that heavy metal bands, such as Metallica and AC/DC, were hiding subliminal messages in their songs, and that these lyrics could only be heard when their albums were played backwards. This was a process known as backmasking, and it wasn't just the metal genre that was targeted, but bands such as Queen, Led Zeppelin, and even the Beatles were also accused of doing this, and of being Satanists who were looking to corrupt the youth that was listening to their music. Soon, hundreds of childcare facilities were caught up in lawsuits by parents who claimed that they were part of this phenomenon, and that their children were being lured to Satanism. But these facilities fought back, and time after time, it was proven this was a fallacy. As ever more parents were being proven wrong, the public started to realize that the Satanic Panic was nothing more than a strange type of mass hysteria. And luckily, they started questioning the claims made by preachers and religious authors on the subject. Pazder and Smith's claims in their book were also debunked when several of Smith's claims were found to have been completely fabricated. In one section of the book, she stated that she'd been kept out of school for 81 days, during which time she was forced to participate in satanic rituals. When people started researching her claims, they scrutinized her school records and discovered she'd attended school during the time that the rituals were claimed to have taken place. Furthermore, her claims that several people at these rituals cut off their middle finger were also found to be false when she failed to name any of them. Since so many people were said to have done this, they should have been easy to track down since they would have had a missing middle finger, but no one fitting that description was ever identified. Many of the memories that Smith recounted were found to be similar to scenes in horror movies such as The Exorcist, and most people dismissed her claims despite the popularity of the book. On the 17th of January, 1994, the San Fernando Valley in California was rocked by the third largest earthquake to hit the area in almost a quarter century. And when all was said and done, it was estimated to be the most destructive in 88 years. The event started at 4:30 that morning, while most people were either still asleep or getting ready to commute to work for the day. The epicenter of the quake was just northwest of Los Angeles and about a mile from the Northridge suburb. It measured a 6.8 on the Richter scale, having started over 3 miles underground, and the result was that the Earth's surface split open and deformed over a 1,500 square mile area, sending many people scrambling for safety. The quake was so powerful that it had an effect on the Santa Susana Mountains, which were measured after the fact and found to have risen between 16 to 20 inches. Luckily, most of this type of damage traveled away from densely populated areas, and if this were not the case, the disaster could have been exponentially worse. People living up to 250 miles away would report feeling the quake. It was also fortunate that it took place on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, when many people stayed home from work, and hence traffic was nowhere near as dense as it usually was. Several parking garages collapsed, and if employees had to travel to work as usual, the death toll would have been significantly higher. Nevertheless, some apartment complexes also collapsed due to poor steel frame construction, and 57 people lost their lives. As a result of the quake, several legislative changes were put into place, and the California Earthquake Authority was created, which offered residential earthquake insurance should another large quake hit the area in the future. By the 1990s, Pablo Escobar, the notorious smuggler of illegal substances, was well known in most parts of the world, as he was considered the kingpin of his chosen trade. He started his life of crime while he was still in school, where he sold fake diplomas and falsified report cards. He then started stealing and selling stereo equipment, and did the same with tombstones that he pilfered from cemeteries. He was first arrested after he was caught stealing a car in 1974, but this didn't serve as much of a deterrent, as he started smuggling prohibited substances soon after. Just a few years later, he created a crime syndicate that would eventually become the Medellin Cartel, which at one point earned as much as $420 million every week. Thus, Escobar quickly became not only one of the wealthiest criminals, but one of the richest people in the world. It's estimated that by this point, he'd amassed a fortune worth about $25 billion, and he made no effort to hide this fact. He spent his money with abandon, purchasing luxury mansions, vehicles, planes, and designer clothing. He held lavish parties that characters from the criminal underground attended, bribed officials, and even offered to pay off Colombia's national debt in exchange for exemption from extradition, should he ever be captured. When the law started closing in on him and his cartel in the early 1990s, he spent a staggering $2 million to keep his family safe and to remain on the run. Before this, though, he'd purchased a house in Hacienda Napoles, a 7,000-acre estate close to Bogota. He bought it for $63 million, and the property included swimming pools, statues of dinosaurs, a soccer field, an airstrip, tennis courts, man-made lakes, and even a zoo that contained 200 animals of different species. These included giraffes, ostriches, camels, zebras, and elephants. Many of these animals were taken from their natural habitats in other countries and smuggled to the estate aboard Escobar's private planes, but they would later be relocated to proper zoos where they received the care they needed. But Escobar did attempt to repair some of the damage to his reputation through philanthropy. He sheltered the poor, built hospitals, and even built a soccer stadium, after which he sponsored several soccer teams. But most people saw through the facade, and in the early 90s, an investigation into his unlawful activities was launched. The justice minister who headed this operation was later found murdered, and it's thought that this was done under Escobar's orders. He knew, though, that it was only a matter of time before the law caught up with him, and in 1991, he suggested that he be allowed to construct his own prison, and if this was allowed, he would hand himself over to the police. The government agreed to this strange request, and Escobar then constructed a building known as the Cathedral. He was confined to the prison, but he had access to all of its amenities, including a sauna, nightclub, soccer field, telephones, computers, and fax machines. With all of this at his disposal, he would continue running his cartel from prison, but his time there soon came to an end when he ended the lives of 2 of his cartel members, and he was slated to be transferred to a more appropriate prison. But before this could be done, he hatched a successful escape plan, and Colombian authorities, along with US officials, started searching for him. The day after his 44th birthday, he was tracked down at Medellin. As the building was being stormed, he managed to make it onto the roof of his house along with his bodyguard, but he failed to escape and lost his life when he was fired upon. Thus, his reign as kingpin finally came to an end. When most of us are faced with an emotional problem, we try to deal with the issue in a healthy and productive way. But one man named Sean Nelson, a US Army veteran, chose the opposite of this in 1995, when he went on an unprecedented rampage through the streets of San Diego. According to those who knew Nelson at the time, he was going through some emotional issues and had made some worrying remarks about his life and several heinous events that had been reported on in the news. His mental state only deteriorated, and on the 17th of May that year, he left his house at around 6:30 p.m. and headed to the California Army National Guard Armory. Upon his arrival there, he realized that many of the Armory's employees were working later than usual, and that the gate to the vehicle yard had been left unattended. He entered the yard unseen and attempted to steal a tank, but was unable to start the engine. He then tried another with the same result, but when he got into a 7-ton M60A3 Patton tank, the engine roared to life and his rampage was underway. Before he could leave the yard, though, a guard realized what was happening, and he attempted to stop Nelson, but was unable to do so. He then ran to a phone and contacted the police, who immediately responded. Luckily, Nelson was unable to utilize any of the tank's weapons since they weren't loaded, and the ammunition was being stored elsewhere. Soon after leaving the yard, he was being chased by officers from the California Highway Patrol, San Diego Police Department, and the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. It was by no means a high-speed chase, since the tank could only reach a maximum speed of 30 miles per hour. But its destructive capabilities were a major concern, coupled with Nelson's worrying mental state. For the next 23 minutes, he flattened road signs, pushed over utility poles and traffic lights, destroyed fire hydrants, and damaged as many as 40 cars that were parked on the street. Before long, news outlets got word of the unfolding rampage, and much of the incident was televised. Many areas were left without gas and electricity, thanks to the damage that had been done, leaving more than 5,000 people in the dark. Nelson then drove the tank onto Interstate 805, where he did his best to destroy a pedestrian bridge, but when the pillars proved to be too much of a challenge, he gave up and continued driving. He headed onto State Route 163, where he struck several vehicles, but along the way, he tried to drive over a median barrier, causing the tank to get stuck, and it came to a standstill when one of its tracks became dislodged. Nelson refused to exit the tank, and in a desperate attempt to bring the rampage to an end, 4 officers climbed onto the vehicle. They used bolt cutters to open the hatch and ordered Nelson to step out so that he could be arrested, but he still refused. He continued to attempt to dislodge the tank by repeatedly driving it backward and forward, but to no avail. One of the officers then drew his weapon and fired at Nelson, bringing the incident to a close. He was taken to Sharp Memorial Hospital, where he was treated, but eventually passed away from his injury. Miraculously, no one was injured or lost their lives during the rampage, but Nelson had caused about $150,000 worth of damage throughout the city. Gianni Versace will forever be remembered as one of the world's finest fashion designers. He opened his first boutique in Milan in 1878, and these proved to be so popular that by the time of his passing, he'd opened a further 129 of these stores. His designs became popular among A-list celebrities, who could be seen wearing his clothes on the red carpet at high-end functions, such as the Academy Awards. And before long, he had amassed a fortune of around $800 million. His fashion shows were attended by the rich and famous, and by the 1980s, he'd become a household name. By the time the 90s arrived, he'd achieved huge success, and he started looking for a new home where he could spend some time out of the spotlight. During one trip to Miami, Florida in 1991, he found a mansion in South Beach that he instantly fell in love with, and he decided to purchase it. He told media outlets that the atmosphere in the house was different from anywhere in the world, and that he considered it to be his haven away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But it's here that one of the biggest tragedies in the fashion world would play out. Versace had owned the mansion for 6 years, and on the morning of the 15th of July, 1997, he decided to go for a walk. He had just revealed his fall 1997 collection, and the Italy-America Chamber of Commerce had informed him that they'd be awarding him with the Citizen of the Year award. Hence, he was spending some much-needed time away to relax and recuperate. That morning, he walked to the new cafe, which was situated on Ocean Drive, wearing black shorts, sandals, and a white t-shirt. He was known to visit the cafe often and usually bought a few magazines while he was there, and this morning was no different. He bought, among others, an Entertainment Weekly and Vogue magazine before heading back to the mansion, a walk that took about 10 minutes to complete. When he arrived, he opened the front gates, but before he could enter the grounds, a man approached him, produced a firearm, and discharged it twice at point-blank range. A witness to the incident rushed to his aid, but they realized there was nothing that could be done, as Versace had already passed away. Versace's partner, Antonio D'Amico, saw the incident unfold, and he, along with the butler, rushed over to the scene. D'Amico was removed from the scene almost immediately, and Versace was rushed to the Jackson Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced deceased. It would later come to light he was one of 5 victims who'd been attacked by the same man, 27-year-old Andrew Cunanan, who had a genius IQ. His rampage started on the 27th of April when he attacked his best friend, 28-year-old Jeffrey Tail. He then ended the life of 33-year-old David Madsen, for whom he had unrequited romantic feelings. These 2 crimes were committed in Minnesota, and Cunanan fled to Chicago, where he ended the life of Lee Miglin, a 75-year-old real estate agent. His 4th victim was 45-year-old William Reese, who was attacked in New Jersey, and after ending his life, Cunanan stole his pickup truck. He then drove to Miami, where he rented an apartment and seemingly started living life as normal while living in Normandy Plaza. On the 15th of July, he checked out, traveled to Versace's mansion, and ended his life. He was tracked down at a houseboat in Miami on the 23rd of July, but was found deceased. To this day, no one knows why Cunanan targeted the fashion icon, since it's believed that they never met, and his motive may never come to light. The name Surinder Gill may not be familiar to most people, but he's the subject of an unsolved crime that has baffled investigators since 1990. He started a successful career as a financial advisor in Southall, England in the 1980s, and many homeowners living in that area had arranged according to his advice. Residents in the area had grown accustomed to seeing him driving his maroon Mercedes, and by all accounts he was well liked by everyone who got to know him. But on the 30th of January, 1990, his family's lives would be changed forever. The day started out as any other, before it, as Surinder made calls on his cell phone while driving in his car. He was in the habit of conducting much of his business from his vehicle, and was even known to eat his lunch while sitting in the car. This was an efficient way of going about his business, since he could make and receive calls while driving to meet with other clients. But this morning would turn out very differently. At around 2 p.m., he drove along South Road when he was attacked by someone and abducted. Witnesses who saw the incident unfold would later tell the police that it seemed completely unprovoked and that the attacker removed Surinder and placed him in the back of the vehicle. At the time, he was on a call with a business associate, and they heard the attack unfold. When the first witness was questioned, they were unable to provide a description of the attacker since he was wearing a motorcycle helmet. But he seemingly had little interest in fleeing, as he then got into the driver's seat of the car and started driving around London with the helmet still on his head. Several people would come forward to report the strange incident. The man then drove to Merrick and on to Greenford Road before turning around and heading back to Southall. It was then spotted in Hounslow, where the attacker drove it across a set of playing fields in Beavers Open Space Park. Surinder's family had no idea what had happened, but they started to become concerned as he hadn't returned home and wasn't answering his phone. He had also not picked up his daughter from school. It would later come to light that Surinder had acted strangely earlier that day. An employee at a Comet Electronics warehouse reported that he'd inquired about changing his cell phone since his was acting up. It should be noted that this reportedly happened hours after his abduction, and the employee stated that he was acting normally. The next morning, he was found deceased in his car, having been attacked with a sharpened blade. It was determined that he'd been attacked by at least 2 people the previous night. It was suggested he was involved in a money laundering operation, but this was never proven, and the crime has never been solved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.